welcome to episode 11 of the Pilgrim song. I am your host, Alexander, and we are back with Charlie. He's a pretty awesome guy. He let me borrow his car this week. So if you don't have a friend like Charlie, you should probably get one. This would be some good advice for life. I think that I don't even know. Good to have you back. There we go.
Yeah, it's always good to be back.
So as I want to mention this because I haven't said it on a lot of the other podcasts, but we are so thankful for you guys listening. The listenership is exponentially growing, and so both on YouTube and on Spotify and Anchor. So really thankful for you guys, and we hope that this is an encouraging thing to you and encouraging for your life. And again, if we say something that you disagree with, we want to also hear your input about that type of thing. But hopefully we'll be back and we'll come up with some creative things to help you stay engaged and loving God's word. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that.
Yeah. I mean, and if any of the listeners have any things that they want to hear, I guess, talked about, feel free to reach out. I mean, I'm sure you guys have some great ideas as well and things that maybe you've been questioning. So feel free to hit us up.
Definitely. So we don't have any, we're not scarce on ideas, but definitely we would love to hear what you want us to talk about. So this week I want to talk about a subject it impacts both of us, but it impacts all of people who are of Christ. It's something that I think that we have either struggled with or we haven't handled the best, particularly in recent days. So I really want to talk about the subject of biblical masculinity. And that means we are not trying to conform it to a societal standard, but merely we're going to look at people in the Bible who are acting in the ways that God has called them to, and we're supposed to be reflective of that. So I think that maybe it's a combination of society, maybe it's just a combination of our culture where we have either put manhood too much on a high level where it's almost infallible instead of actually focusing on what God has called us to. So we want to be focused on that today. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce it with a more secular type of approach, first of all. So if you're a Mandalorian fan, which if you aren't, you should probably watch The Mandalorian because it's pretty great. But The Mandalorian, it reinvigorated people's passion for Star Wars for a lot of reasons. For me, one part that I loved about it is this balance of the Mandalorian, both him being he's just really good at fighting people, which I love, but he's also really compassionate to Baby Yoda. I just really enjoy that because we get to see him and he's kicking butt and he's shooting people and all that type of stuff, which, it's nice. It's nice that it's cool to watch, I guess. But a lot of the times he's motivated by the fact that he's protecting somebody else, particularly Grogu, Baby Yoda, whichever one you prefer. So that's kind of like the basis that I want to be thinking about, is that there's this dichotomy that the Mandalorian, his name is Din Djarin, his manhood is not dissipated because he cares so much about Baby Yoda. That's not at all in question. He's really strong and he's got strong character. As a matter of fact, the fact that he cares so much is what drives him to do some of these really extraordinary, awesome things. So I think that's really important for us as we think about how biblical manhood should be framed. Is not based upon, I don't feel anything, I'm not a vulnerable person, I'm just going to be really strong and never talk about my injuries and all this type of stuff. That's not helpful. So that's the way I thought. I'm sure Charlie has a different example if you asked him, but that was what I was thinking about.
No, that's a great example. Yeah, no, that's really good. So I guess we should have said this spoiler warning for those of you who haven't watched it yet. But yeah,
no,
that's what it's about.
You should have watched it. It's been out for a while now at this point. But but yeah, so we've been talking. I mean, I guess this is something we've talked about a bit, trying to be, because we know each other a little bit, but we're still trying to become better friends. And there's been a lot of things in my life to this point, or at least I've gone on recently, where I've realized that I need to be a lot more vulnerable with my guy friends, because it's very easy to just come in and say, I'm okay, we're just chilling, we'll talk about sports and whatever, and then never really talk about things that we're struggling with and things that we can't really talk to women about. So I think there's a lot of importance that we need to put on that. So as we talk about this, I'm sure Charlie and I will be candid and will not really try to mess around with it. We want to be serious, and we really want to address this thing because women are supposed to hold us to some standard in the biblical standard, and we're supposed to hold one another to the standard as well. So really want to be focused on that. So I wanted for us to think about this and start our little discussion here. I've been pretty shocked, frustrated, appalled at some of the ways that I've heard men, Christian men, those who proclaim themselves as Christian men, describe and talk about women. There is also these running ideas that if you give your friend, a male friend, a hug, then you're going to have to preface it with no homo or anything like that because you don't want to be seen as that instead of just showing platonic love and care for the people around you. There's also the idea that continues to go on where men are to be to be a provider as a man is good, but if you are struggling to provide and your wife goes out to work, that's not a negative thing. And I think that a lot of men do stick out their necks for their families, and they should, and I think that's a good thing. But to act like only one person has to do that and it has to be the man, I don't think that's really a biblical concept either. But we also have the idea that men, once they go to work early in the morning, they come back a little bit late at night, and then they just come in and they sit there. Like, I guess my idea is like the 1950s, and they have newspapers.
But easy chair, man.
Yeah.
Put your feet up.
But the news, they just sit in front of the TV and they watch ESPN, and they just order sweet teas and all that type of stuff. They don't really care about the kids. They don't ask the kids about what happened at work or at school, not work. They just don't care about that type of stuff. There's also this mentality of boys will be boys, that if a guy or if your child is doing something that's pretty toxic from a young age, and you're like, well, if he's angry and just doing bad stuff, it's just because he's a boy. And it's like, well, you have to discipline him so that he doesn't act like this for the rest of his life. And then there's this idea continuing on about toxic masculinity. And I think we've heard a lot of males get like the automatic reaction.
Yeah, it's a triggering phrase.
Yeah.
People get very offended when you say things like that about toxic masculinity and boys will be boys. Those kind of phrases are controversial to some people, for sure.
But I think that the fact that you're prefacing it with toxic means that this isn't true masculinity. It's literally like a perversion of what masculinity should be. So if you're acting toxic, if you're overly angry, you're overly greedy, and those types of things, it's evil. It's wrong. And we should be able to say that's toxic and masculine versus what's truly masculine, what's biblically masculine. So it's been frustrating for me in my experience. Do you have a similar one?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely an important topic because this subject particularly really fuels a bad reputation of Christians and of the church specifically, in the view that a lot of people have of, I know it's a lot of men in the world, especially right now in the culture changes that we're kind of going through, specifically in the U.S., but also within the church as well. People view like Christian men as like, demanding husbands. They don't let their wives do anything. They're all about power. They have total control and all this stuff. And to be fair, there is a lot of that goes on. And I think a lot of people, Christians especially, have this kind of misconception of what masculinity is. They don't really, look to the scripture, because if what we're going to do here in a little bit, when we actually look at examples in the Bible, I think we see a very opposite picture painted of what true manhood is and what it should be from what we are oftentimes taught or grown up learning about, whether it's from the culture around us, from movies, TV shows, music, any of that kind of stuff, other people around you, or if it's from the church itself. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of like joking that goes on between guys about different things like that. But, joking, it can be dangerous because, whether or not you're saying something sarcastically or whether or not you're just, trying to say something funny to get a laugh or two, things like that stick. The things that you say stick. Even if it's meant as a joke, it still makes some level of an impact on the person that hears it, especially if you're saying it around young people who might not realize what you're saying is a joke, or that you're just trying to be funny when you say things like, women need to get back in the kitchen, like all that, those kinds of things. Even though you may just be saying them to be funny, some people will take those to heart and those things will stick in their minds. And so you have to be careful with that kind of stuff. I mean, it goes on a lot in the church. Let's just be real. You know, people say, I'm guilty of that. You know, I've been guilty of making jokes and things like that to people. But looking back on my life, I mean, you know, though I don't agree with it, a lot of those ideas, the reason why I even know them to begin with is because I heard people making jokes and making fun of things like that. And then, you know, I think we can easily slip into actually having that mindset, and then we find ourselves actually living our lives in that way. Which I think we'll find out hopefully is wrong and is opposite to the way that we should be living.
Yeah. And as Charlie was correctly mentioning, we're not trying to high horse people here. We're not trying to say, oh, we've been perfectly biblical males all of our entire lives. So, but as you grow, you start seeing that some of these really toxic, bad behaviors aren't actually what God calls us to. It's merely just either cultural things, or perhaps it's just like it's natural in our manhood, and then in our sex, but then we kind of just allow that to control everything about us instead of letting God control our desires. So I think that as Charlie and I, the reason we're talking about is we need to take a good look at what the Bible says about manhood, and we address it in the best way we can. So yeah, thankfully, as we mentioned, the things that we talked about, whether it be domineering over your wife, that's one other thing. Like, people talking about hating their wives. Like, why was that a thing? Why people? I don't know. Crazy. But that type of attitude, it's not a Christian concept. Because you're held to high esteem. You're supposed to hold your wife to high esteem. And we have a really high call, whether it be as a single male or as a married male or anything like that. So in this podcast, as we're going to go through it, we're going to talk particularly about a couple of characters, emphasizing some great examples of biblical manhood, but also the awful side of people who fail to be biblically manly. So we're going to address these types of things, and we'll get right on that. All right, so we are going to jump in. This is going to be a little bit of a different discussion than a lot of the ones that we've had on this podcast, where we do a lot of reading and we try to exegete quite a bit here. But we're just going to kind of address things, and you have the freedom to read them afterwards. But we're just going to be talking about some examples from the Bible about the difference between like this toxic masculinity type idea and what is true biblical masculinity. And as Charlie and I both think are really good examples of this are David and Jonathan, because what we see in them are these two people who actually have a lot of love for God and have a lot of love for each other as well. So, I don't. Do you want to talk about any of the ones that really jump out at you about?
Yeah, I mean, Jonathan? So like the cool thing about them is obviously they're both very emotional, what we would probably classify as emotional people. Mm-hmm. But yet at the same time, I'm pretty sure either one of them could absolutely destroy me in about a second without a thought, because these men were also both very successful in war, especially David. Mm-hmm. And we know that he was a very bloody king, killed a lot of people, but also was very emotional and would be what we would, kind of classify as like in touch with his feminine side or whatever, like people would want to say today as well. And so you kind of see this cool, very well-rounded person. Kind of gives us a good example of what we can also be like too. Mm-hmm. Because if someone like David can be like that, and David was a man after God's own heart and is highly respected in the church, then that's someone that we can model our lives after as well.
Yeah,
well,
for sure.
For the most part.
Yeah. Just like with all Old Testament examples, there are some flaws with David. But as Charlie was mentioning, like, David played instruments for Saul. Like he did that. He wrote most of the Psalms that we have in the book of Psalms. He danced before the ark of the Lord when it was being returned. Like he was a very expressive individual. Charlie talked a little bit about his crying, and he and Jonathan cried over each other, with each other, and all that type of stuff. But at the same time, when they said that David kills 10,000s, that wasn't really a hyperbole. Like he, as Charlie mentioned, he could probably kill us pretty easily. So there's not this separation between a masculine person never feels anything, never really pours that out himself, but they certainly can, and they can also be very strong in that type of idea. So yeah, there's, as we talked about, like Jonathan and David, they have a really, really close bond, a really close relationship. And when you think about what has been delivered to his plate, that his dad ends his reign. Like there's no way for Jonathan to become king. And Jonathan, instead of being, well, toxic and just deciding, well, I'm not going to help this guy, I'm not going to care about this guy, can't stand him, hate him, whatever, he decides to be rather his best friend and does whatever he can to serve David, even protecting him from his own father. It's this awesome amount of care. And again, this mutual male vulnerability type of thing. So,
and it's, we were talking, in the break about David's sons, right? And the way they reacted, right? When Solomon was going to become king, the way that some of his sons handled the situation and how his family kind of fell apart. That could have easily, like you said, that easily could have been the way Jonathan reacted to finding out that Saul's reign was going to end, and therefore he had no, because it was his throne. He would have been, by the worldly standards of how a kingship works, I guess it's what to call it. He's in line. He's the next in line for the throne. It's his. He is the next to be king, and then all of a sudden he's not anymore. But his friendship with David was stronger than his greediness and his desire to be on the throne. He just wanted to be a servant to the next king. And we see them have an extremely close bond together. I mean, it is like the best friendship, I think, in the Bible out of any two people, and it's between two guys, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I mean, they're so close that, people, wrongfully speculate things were going on, between the two of them. I mean, I definitely think you're wrong if you think that there was anything, non-platonic about their relationship, because it was. But yeah, I mean, they were just, when you think about what the Proverbs defines like a friend that sticks closer to the brother, that's literally David and Jonathan. They are closer than family members.
For sure. And I love bringing that idea, because I think part of the reason, I'm not going to say this is the reason why men struggle with porn and then just continue to struggle in it, but I think that we just lack a lot of vulnerability when it comes to putting it out there. And that might also be a church culture thing where everyone's supposed to come in with this mask that you're perfect, and then when you reveal you're not perfect, then people berate you like that's not the point. That's not the reason I've come to Jesus. So there's a lot of things to be vulnerable with each other about, the things that it's not even necessarily sin. Sometimes it's just, I'm struggling with life. I'm struggling with mental illness. I'm struggling with depression. Any of those types of things, being vulnerable with your male friends is really important. And we see that it works out with Jonathan and David. And it's to this point that, like, after Jonathan's death, one of the cool stories of the Bible is David and Mephibosheth. Where he protects Jonathan's son and like brings him to his own house. And it's like, that's how much he loved and cared about him. So really important aspect there.
I mean, David had a lot of women in his life, right? Not as many as his son Solomon, but still he had a lot of women. David very much loved women. And we see that in the way that he, lived his life, and a lot of the mistakes that he made. Probably the biggest mistake that he made in his life had to do with a woman, Bathsheba. And we see what that cost him in the end. But yet the person that we see David be the most open with, and the person that he probably had the closest relationship with, bigger than any of the women that he had in his life, was Jonathan. Honestly, that's the person that we see him have that closest bond with, and the person that we see him be the most vulnerable with, because it was, probably the hardest time in David's life, going through that transition of the power change and dealing with his Jonathan's dad Saul coming after him and constantly being on the run. And his rock in that situation was his best friend Jonathan. Yeah. So
it's a really touching thing, again, about friends and the need for men to just be vulnerable with each other about that. So and again, that's something that's very much I don't know, is it frowned upon, or it's just like weird societal?
Yeah, it's just like this. I think it's just kind of weird. Like, there's like this stigma surrounding, guys being vulnerable and being emotional, and how it makes you weak, right? Yeah. Crying and showing emotions is a sign of weakness. But it's not, and we see a very different picture painted in the Bible, not just with David and Jonathan, but other examples that we'll talk about as well, of people that got very emotional, and showed what we would have, viewed as kind of, they're just being a woman, or they're just being, whatever. Which is, by the way, very offensive to women. Yeah, to also say that all women are emotional as well. It's just as bad on the opposite end of that. When guys say that, it's bad on ourselves, and it puts, that stigma of, how guys can't be emotional around us. But it also would make women feel terrible as well, because that means that, it's this whole idea of women are emotional and guys are rational, and that's just not true. Nope. In fact, most of the people that we see in the Bible, it's an opposite picture, where the men are the emotional ones, and the women are oftentimes the rational people that we see in the Bible. Literally David and Abigail.
Yeah. Yep. It's like, so David shows that negative trait as well. And that's why you don't follow David, you follow Christ. But David does give a good example for what to do and not to do. So yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. Just making emotion, almost putting in this negative light and painting it as an exclusively female thing is just, that's not helpful for anybody. Yeah. Everyone has emotions, and it would be much better if we were honest with those. So yeah. In my experience, kind of like it was my senior year when I finally decided to join chorus. And the reason it took me so long was because I was trying to get past this idea of men don't really sing like you did in church. But like being in male chorus, that was a weird thing. But it was something I was super passionate about. I still love doing it. And I think that's kind of been painted a negative light too, that if you like to sing, or if you like to, unless you're playing acoustic guitar, that's the only time, that's the only time that's really manly. But the expression that you put out in song, particularly when we're singing in service and stuff like that, it should be worn on your sleeve. It should be emotional, because you are pouring out your heart to the person who saved you, to the king of the universe. So we should take it seriously. I think that's kind of been discouraged a bit when it comes to men.
It's just like any kind of being artistic in any way. It's just kind of, I don't know. Yeah, it's weird. It's just weird.
It is very
typically
weird.
As a guy, you're not looked at to be that way. You're supposed to be that strong guy, and being artsy is weird. Sewing or knitting or cooking or any of that kind of stuff. No, guys don't really do that. That's women's work. It's what the joke that I've heard growing up. Which again, just don't. If you're joking about stuff like that, just stop. Yeah. Just stop. That's the reason why people still feel that way, and those things still happen in the church, is because we still make jokes about them and things like that. So
it's time to grow up.
My wife always reminds me that there's always a little bit of truth behind every joke that is told. So if you're telling those jokes, and odds are you probably feel that way in some way inside you, whether you realize it or not, or whether you want to admit it or not.
For sure. So good points from Charlie. Yeah. We'll definitely come back and loop around that towards the end when we're talking about more applications.
Sorry, I got on my soapbox.
No, we're about to soapbox. It'll be real. One of the things I really love about David, part of what David does, and something I've had to grow up about a lot, is when it comes to stubbornness and insistence that you are right. Because when Nathan comes to him and tells him about his sin with Bathsheba, he reveals that he knows, reveals what he's done, David's first reaction isn't to blame everything else in the world, or blame everything else in society, or blame all this other type of stuff. And we see that's the reaction of Samuel, and that's the reaction of, frankly, a lot of males, that we are stubborn and insistent that we are correct, and that no one can ever change our mind about anything. But the reality is, when David saw he was wrong, he was willing to admit that he was wrong. And Psalm 51 is a really beautifully written poem about the reminder of what David did. He emphasized what it did to his relationship with God, but as we see through the story, it hurt his relationship with Bathsheba for sure. So Yeah, when he saw what he did, he was willing to admit that he was wrong, and I think that's just something that I've struggled with a lot. I don't want to
always.
I don't want to paint every male as that way, as we've been trying not to do, but it's something that we have to really strive to be admitting that. And then also another trait of David is I love that he is oftentimes seen as a defender of the innocent. So that means that he used his strength, which was quite mighty, but he used it in the right way. When he was using it to defend people or uphold the honor of God in 1 Samuel 17, the battle against Goliath. That's when oftentimes when he used his battle. But I already brought up the bad example when he was going to kill Nabal out of his just frustration. So David failed, of course. But there is a time and a place to use our energies and our strengths. So when we use it on petty fights and stuff like that, it's not the place. But if there is a chance, an opportunity for us to protect the innocent in particular, that's when we should be using the strength that God's given. So, you have anything else on David?
No, I think that's about all I have.
That's so.
Two very strong men who were also very close with one another and very emotional with one another and open with one another. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that relationship. In fact, that's what you should have. Yeah. And I would encourage anyone who doesn't have someone like that in their life to, seek after it. It's always good to have, someone like that you can be vulnerable with and open up with and be that way.
Yeah. Pursuing healthy male-male friendships is really important. So do it. The other example that we can give of course, the ultimate biblically minded masculine person is Jesus. You can't talk about the subject without talking about him, that when God became incarnate, he became a man. And Jesus is like the epitome of, I think, probably the opposite of what people think of when it comes to American masculinity.
Probably. Most people in America would probably not. I think we've painted Jesus in an American picture sometimes, and we kind of view him in that way, but in reality, he was probably not what most people would expect today to see if you could go back and actually see how he lived his life.
For sure. There's so many traits about him. I like almost one of the first ones that pops in my head is this idea of how he answered people or how he talked with people. It's this combination of he's truthful, but he's also graceful and loving. Yeah. So when we come into a society where if you tell the truth, you're telling it so mean that people are more offended by your words than what you're actually saying. And it's like, why would I ever listen to you? So people will falsely say, oh, they're just mad at me that I'm telling the truth. And it's like, no, they're mad at you because you're a jerk. Yeah. But then there's also this thing where people will never tell you the truth about anything. So they're too loving. That's not really the most loving thing to do, but they're too loving to tell you honestly how your behavior affects other people or how it's affecting you. And Jesus strikes right in the middle. This perfect telling you what you need to do, that you cannot continue to live in sin, but he also did it because he cared and he loved people, and it was very genuine. So I think just the way that Jesus speaks to people is very counter what a lot of culture teaches. So you have any what sticks out to you about Jesus?
Jesus again he's an emotional person too, right? Mm-hmm. He is God, but he was also human. And we see his emotion throughout the Bible in multiple situations, right? The first is, one of the more famous Bible passages, John 11:35, because it's the shortest, right? 2 words, all you need. Jesus wept, right? He cried. Jesus wasn't afraid to cry. He wasn't afraid to show those emotions. In fact, he was so unafraid that now we have it written down to where millions of people have read that. And millions of people have now, not seen Jesus, but read about how Jesus cried. And that didn't make him any less of a man because he cried, right? That actually makes him more relatable because he did, right? That makes him more human, makes him, seem more like someone that you could really have a relationship with. Not this person that's up on a pedestal so far away it's unattainable, but someone who's, just like you and I. Also, in the garden, one of my favorite moments in Jesus's life is when he is praying in the garden before he is about to be delivered over for trial and eventually sacrifice when he's crucified. He was scared, right? We don't see a picture of this super tough guy who's, putting on his armor, getting his swords ready. In fact, when Peter draws his sword and cuts off an ear, Jesus is like, no, that's not what we're going to do. That's not how we're going to handle the situation, right? We see someone very opposite of what we would think, and opposite of what they expected too, because they expected a Messiah to come down and be a king, just like David, and take back Jerusalem and restore it to its old glory and bring back its kingdom. But instead you get this very humble, very meek guy. And we see his, extreme vulnerability there in the garden when his life is nearing an end. He gets very scared, and he is anxious, and he is, trying to lean on his apostles, although they sleep, like any of us. Relatable. For sure. But we see him being scared and behaving in a way that, I think people in our culture would want to view and say is weak. Oh, he's just weak. He's not strong enough to handle that, right? He needs to man up and take it, He knows what he needs to do. Just do it. But no, we see him scared. We see him cry during his life. And again, that's what makes him such a good, relatable person, is because he is that way, and it paints a picture of how we should be, right? We should model our lives exactly after Jesus. He never made a mistake, right? He's literally the person that we're supposed to be just like. So if Jesus can be vulnerable, if he can be scared, if he can cry, and he's a guy, he's a man, and I don't think anyone would argue that point, that's how we can be too. That's how we should be too. So
for sure. I mean, there's a lot of other cool, like, little things about Jesus that, the fact that he's a carpenter also meant that, like, he's a hard worker.
Yep.
Very dedicated to his craft. I'm sure he was good at it. So we also have him singing with his disciples as he's heading to the garden. As Charlie was saying, that he was very raw, very emotional. He was also very humble. Considering the fact that he was always correct, it's going to be a little bit harder for him to be like, oh yeah, he's going to change his mind about anything. But he went to children and he went to women who were looked down on this culture, and that's who he associated with. He associated with the sinners and the outcasts. And, that's something that we should be doing, instead of rather we want to stick with our side and the popular side, or whatever that may be, whatever you want to call it. Rather, he goes to the people who are meek. And I love that aspect as well. So, as Charlie mentioned, Jesus is the ultimate example. So if you want to know how you should handle the situation, how you should handle the situation as a man, you should be looking at Jesus. And he's going to do it perfectly.
Yeah.
So.
And we also see another side of him too, right? He wasn't just vulnerable all the time. He wasn't, just crying all the time. We also see him walk into the temple and flip tables over and drive people out with a whip that he made himself. That gets overlooked. He literally made himself a whip and drove people out of the temple. Like, that's awesome. Yeah. But we see a very strong difference, right, in different moments of his life, where we see him go from this very strong-willed, fighter, driving people out of the temple because he's upset with the way they're handling, the Lord's house. And then we see him go to this man who's breaking down and crying and weeping because his really good friend died. And so, yeah, that's just another example of
exists in the same man.
Yeah.
So we should be that angry when righteousness is being spat upon, when it's being disregarded, especially by those who claim themselves to be of Christ, and then they go out and they act completely opposite of Christ. It should be something that makes us angry. But we see that, again, as Charlie was mentioning, we see this awesome picture of, here is a man who is so dedicated to righteousness that he is going to use anger in the best way possible to usurp whatever is going on in the temple. So it's very interesting. Anything else on Jesus, though?
Oh, there's so much on Jesus.
There's so much.
Yeah, we could go on forever. But no, I don't have anything else on it.
When you want to think about men to model your life after, it should be Jesus. But there are good examples that we see within David and Jonathan as well, about whether it be vulnerability, the combination of vulnerability and strength. You can be vulnerable and strong. You can be emotional and strong. Those are not just, I can't even think of the word. They're not completely separated. Yeah. So we should be really focused on that we should be more vulnerable, but continue to be strong, and strong ultimately in the Lord.
And I think showing emotion and being vulnerable, that increases your strength even more. That makes you even a stronger person, because you're able to deal with different situations in your life better than you would be by yourself. I mean, I know I'm young. I would think most people are young. So I haven't lived a lot of life yet by any means, but there have been things that I have had to deal with that a lot of people don't necessarily have to deal with in their lives, and that's a subject for another podcast. But in those difficult times in my life, I tried to handle it like a man should, right? Where I would keep my emotions into myself. Don't cry, don't be sad, just man up, be the rock for your family. Be the strong one that people can lean on, take the world's problems on my back and deal with them myself, and keep all of my emotions in, because, I'm trying to be this strong powered man, or at least what I thought was a strong powered man. And it ruined my mental health. Like, I mean, it did absolutely. Like, trying to deal with problems like that all the time, especially big problems that you're going to face in your life, trying to keep all of your emotions inside yourself is going to degrade your mental health significantly. And it's going to make it so much harder for you to continue to that. And you're going to hit a wall eventually where you just can't. We can only take on so much before our minds just can't handle anymore. And I hit that wall. And I still deal with the problems from that and from the way that I handled that today. But it was when I found people that I could lean on, other people, whether it is, my wife or some of my really closest guy friends, being able to open up to them and to have conversations with them and to be honest with them and to cry with them over the things that were going on in my life, that helped me out so much. Built my relationship up with those people, and also built my relationship up towards God as well, and helped me and still helps me deal with different situations and those things that I go with and the things that I struggle with, because I know that I can lean on other people. So, if that's the way that you're dealing with life, if you're just trying to be a man and just take everything on and carry the world on your shoulders, maybe you haven't hit your wall yet, but I promise you, if you continue to go down that road, you're gonna hit that wall eventually, and it's gonna be really difficult. So I would highly encourage you now, take some of that load off, spread the load around, right? You've got brothers and sisters, maybe physical ones, but also, spiritual ones as well. Find yourself somebody you can open up to and have conversations with, right? It will only make you stronger if you do that. So,
well, I can't say much more on that. That was thank you for your honesty. Yeah. That's a big deal. So just don't bottle it up. Be honest about it. That's part of what's being biblical about being a man this way. So we're going to go to our break, and then we're going to talk about negative examples, which will be really fun. So we'll see y'all. Alrighty, we are back with our third part of our little discussion about biblical masculinity. And of course, we're going to end on the fun part, which is about how terrible sometimes there are very toxic males in Scripture. So we want to address those a little bit, and then talk a little bit about how our culture and how to refine that as people who are trying to live biblically. So our primary example of this is one you chose, so go for it.
Yeah, I think one that for sure came to my mind as a not great example, and probably comes to most people's mind, is Samson. Mm-hmm. Good old Samson. And you and I were just talking about how we view Samson in different ways. Like in my mind, and I don't know how you guys view him, but in my mind, Samson's just this total meathead of a person. Just, I kind of see him as more like a jock type. Whether or not, it doesn't matter what kind of body type he was or anything. We know how he was mentally and physically. And it's not great. He's not really the best person in the Bible by any means, yet the Lord uses him. And, there's a whole discussion to be had in that. That's a podcast in and of itself. We're not going to get into that, but just in general, as an example of a person, if you've never read the story of Samson before, it's in Judges starting 13, in chapter 13 through chapter 16. It really is his whole life story, I guess, because it starts with him before birth and all the way through. And basically, it was this kid that was foretold before he was born, who he was going to be and kind of what he was going to be. He's, to be honest, kind of a type of Christ in some ways in that regard, but he's kind of like the anti-Christ. That's kind of that's a weird thing to say. But like he kind of is. He's kind of like the exact opposite of the way that Jesus was. And throughout his life, right, he has this special ability where in different periods in his life, different situations, the Spirit of the Lord would rush upon him, and he would do these incredible things with both strategically and like planning out different things in the way that he would take on certain situations, but also physically. He was incredibly strong, and we see that in several situations of his life where he takes on a lion just because he was walking by it one day and was just like, oh, there's a lion, killed. Or at the end of his life when he, is chained up and the Philistines have him captured, and he just prays for one more feat of strength, and the Lord, allows it, and he's able to push down the pillars and knock down the building that he was underneath and killed all the Philistines that were on it. Just this big feat of strength that he's able to do. But he's also kind of a terrible person throughout his life. He breaks his Nazirite vow that he's supposed to have numerous times. We see him be incredibly selfish, and most all of his actions are based on him. In fact, it's kind of a poetic way that he ends up getting captured, and the way that they treat him is at the end of his life, he gets his eyes gouged out, basically where he no longer can see, because all throughout his life, the common theme for Samson is that he did whatever he saw was good for his eye. What was right for his eyes is what he would do. His eyes always got him into trouble. He always would look at something and think, oh, that looks good, or I want that, and then he'd do it. He was just kind of a very selfish person. Another thing that we saw was the way that he treated women. David Maxon, whenever he was studying through Judges with us, always likes to make the point that one of the reasons why you can see the judges degrade throughout the book of Judges is you can look at the way they treated women throughout it. And you start off with like Othniel, who was motivated because he had the chance for a wife, Caleb's daughter, if he took a city. And so he did that. He took the city and was able to have Othniel was able to have Caleb's daughter because of that. And then you get to Samson, who just has blatant disregard for women altogether, in the way that he treats them, the way that he talks to them. And it kind of ends up being his downfall in the woman that he ends up with in the end. But just not a great person.
Not a great person. I love that David's point out of that, but he concludes by talking about it. You can tell how well a society is doing by the way they treat their women. So I think that's a really cool way to think about it. But yeah, as cool of a character as Samson is, when it comes I'll probably talk about this a lot on the podcast. I love Marvel superheroes. Like, that is my jam. So Judges, when I was growing up, was like reading a Marvel comic book, but the more I've grown up and seen it, it's like, this is a horror story of like the worst possible situation.
And Samson's cool when you're a kid.
Oh, yeah.
He's a super strong guy. Like, I want to be like, I wish I had super strength. Yeah, come on. And then you get older and you're like, he's the worst. Terrible.
Like, one of the coolest stories I love, it wasn't even until I think 3 years ago, I realized how far that Samson carried the gates of the Philistine town.
The iron gates.
It was 40 miles to Hebron. I was like, that is so cool. And how does he end up in this situation? He's sleeping with a prostitute.
Yep.
And it's like, his earliest encounter, he goes into this Philistine town. He sees this woman. I don't even know if he talked to her, but he just goes back to his parents. Get her for me.
Yep.
It's like, and then lighting, very, very talented, very skillful to catch foxes to put a torch on them. But also, could you not have used that effort and strength and finesse for anything else, anything more productive at all? So yeah, as Charlie was mentioning, like this is a strong guy. He's got a lot of, his gift came directly from God. And what he did was use it to abuse and did whatever he wanted and did whatever he desired. And it's very disastrous. So,
yep. And so, it's kind of the opposite of what we saw in like David and Jonathan, and also in Jesus, where he was, very much, his emotions that he had were very much just whatever pleased him, just kind of whatever he wanted to do. This very, kind of the way culturally that men get viewed oftentimes today, just very self-centered, just men just do whatever they want, right? Boys will be boys, like you talked about, this whole masculinity issue that we have. Samson would have fit, what a guy is supposed to be and what a lot of people view men as. He would have fit that perfectly today. Just, strong, strong-willed, does whatever he wants, sees something and takes it. Women are just objects or just, some part of life, you don't really need them. Well, you need them, but you don't really care about them. Like, motivated by, whatever will get you women, that kind of stuff. And, doesn't work out well for him in the end.
No.
And I don't think many people would view Samson as a role model, nor should view Samson as a role model. No. If you do, I would encourage you to reread those stories. And maybe you should look at your life and see, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Because he's not a good person.
Particularly towards the end, I think it's really easy to demonize Delilah. And it's not like she's good. Like, she's not a good person. But Samson was cruising for a bruising this whole time. Like, the way that he treated everybody in his path. His mom to his first wife, kind of?
Yeah, sort of wife-ish.
There were plenty of things that happened to Samson that were unfair. But Samson, in turn, did just awful things to everybody.
Yep.
So, it's a really sad story in a lot of ways. And for me, as I've been studying through, when I study through it, it's this blessing that Israel received from God. Like, Samson is a picture of Israel at this point, that they had received every blessing from God before they were even born, before they even a thing. And what they did was use it to abuse and do whatever they wanted to do and didn't care about the rules that God had given them. And this is what they were going to end up as, blind and dead. So when we decide to engage in this type of behavior, when we decide that our manliness, whatever that may be, however we phrase that, if it is framed more in how we are strong and how we can get what we want and how we're going to live selfishly and live by exactly whatever desire we want to, it's really dangerous and it's going to pose a lot of problems to us as well as every single person around us and ultimately our relationship with God. So, really dangerous position.
Yeah, and I think, what you said is selfishness, I think, is kind of the key of all that. When we live our lives according to what society may view masculinity as, it's very selfish. It's a very selfish way of living. It's very man-centered. Man is the head. Man is the strongest. Man is all that. That is so selfish. It's not even funny. Which is why we see people like Jesus living their life opposite, because Jesus wasn't selfish, nor should we be. And so I think we need to be careful about not falling in. Again, like you said, we're not perfect. I am guilty of so many bad things and falling into that category of Americanized or whatever you want to say, manhood, modern day manhood a lot. It's easy for guys to fall into that. But it's just selfish. It is, and it's wrong. And it's something that we all need to work on, I think. And that's why it's important that we're talking about it.
Mm-hmm. So you talked a little bit about, well, you just mentioned it, about Americanized manhood. So do you think that this is a more societal issue, or is it like, where do you think this is?
Yeah, that's a fun question. How did we get here, right?
Mm-hmm.
How did we get to the point where obviously there are some big changes happening right now in society. I think a lot of people are recognizing the way that we have been, the way that we continue to be, and there's a lot of changes being made, although there's a lot of apprehension toward those changes from some people. But is it all society? Does it all just come from culture? And I do think that a lot of it does. I don't think that all of it does. Spoiler, I guess, for where I'll get to in the end. But no. I do think a lot of it comes from society. If you look throughout history, right, the way specifically women were treated by society, it's never been great. If I'm just being honest, right? People have never really treated women with a whole lot of respect. A lot of cultures haven't treated women with the respect that they deserve and should get. And so, specifically in America, right, we obviously know that, where you could just go back not even 50 years, and you go back 20 years and you're going to see it. You go back 5 years and you see it. But especially, if you go back to like the 1950s, model home, post World War II, that kind of era where it was, man gets up, goes to work, works all day, wife stays home with the kids and cooks and cleans, and that's her role and that's her job. And the guy comes home and doesn't do anything, like you were talking about, sits up in his easy chair, puts his feet up, and, gets waited on hand and foot. And I think that was, definitely a big part of our culture and society. And so kids being raised in that way and in that society, continued that thought even to today, where there are a lot of men who still view that the household should still be in that way, should still be handled in that sort of way. Men are supposed to be, the heads and the rulers and the leaders, and women, should just stay quiet in the kitchen, and it's all about men, right? And the man should be, this tough guy, because a lot of those men were coming out of a war at that time, out of World War II. And so, the way they viewed life was very differently than the way that we would view it today. And so it was very much strong. You couldn't show emotion. You couldn't get sad. You couldn't get upset, because if you did, you were going to lose the war. And I don't know what that's like. I haven't been in the situation. I have no idea. And I respect the people that had to go through that. But I do think that it pushed our culture in a way that, is opposite from what it probably should be. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on the society side of it?
I do think that I hadn't even thought about the World War II element of it. But
it goes back before.
It goes before, for sure. Women's suffrage, that was around the 1900s, the turn of the century. So I think that there is there's this weird perpetuation I think in society about how even the people who are supposed to be most feminist or whatever, I think there's still this image pushed about, like maybe this idea that women like sex, which isn't wrong. But what happens is it's almost pushing them to the edge of, well, women are supposed to like sex as much as men all the time. And then that makes, if you're a woman and you dress in a certain way, that means that you're asking for it. And that is a way that men can get away with this idea. So they prop themselves up as feminists. We're the real feminists. And then in all the movies and all this type of stuff, women are just scantily clad, and that's supposed to be empowering. And what does that do but let men look at them and lust after them anyway? So it's a combination of, here is a society that is overly sexualized, which all society has been throughout history. But you just find a new way to justify it while still being somehow feminist, somehow elevating women. So at least from my perspective, that's the way I see it a little bit.
No, and that's good. I haven't really thought about that a lot either, and that's a really good point. It's all around us. I mean, it is, and it's been around for forever. It's not new. None of this is new by any means whatsoever. If you think that it is, I would encourage you to go take a look at history, or even read the Bible and read about the way that women were treated in the Bible, and the way men, were treated in the Bible as well. Which I guess kind of moves into the next thing. Is it all just society driven specifically for Christians? And I would say no to that. I don't think that it is, all because of, society and the world around us. The reason why specifically Christian men tend to have this view of the home and the way things are supposed to be and the way men are supposed to be. I think a lot of the ideas that people get, or the place people get a lot of these ideas from is from the Bible. And it's controversial. And it pushes a lot of people away from the Bible, because a lot of people view the Bible as this very like misogynistic book of like all about men. Women are terrible. It's men are everything, Why do women even exist kind of idea. And so it pushes a lot of people away from becoming a Christian or even reading and studying the Bible, because they go into it with the idea of, well, the Bible's just sexist, right? Christians are all just sexist. And to be fair, a lot of what they say is based off of how they see Christians act. A lot of people haven't read the Bible and haven't really read it and studied it. They just see how we as Christians behave ourselves in the way that we talk and the way that we act and the things that we align ourselves with typically. And that's why they get those opinions about us and about the Bible, is because they see the way that we live our lives. And so I think a lot of the reason why Christian men have this kind of idea of what manhood is and masculinity is because of things that we've been taught, or things that we've heard from the pulpit, or things that we've misinterpreted in the Bible itself, and maybe we're getting wrong and not really realizing what true manhood actually is.
Yeah.
I think a lot of our concepts come from misinterpretations of the Bible.
I think so too. I don't think the point of this podcast is not supposed to be like, we don't think that men have a duty, particularly in the household, to lead. I believe that is a God-given responsibility. But the leadership is not this, as Charlie was mentioning, you don't come home and just hit your wife and hit your kids and everyone waits on you hand and foot. Yeah. As a matter of fact, Ephesians 4, when Paul is talking about women are called to submit to their husbands and husbands are called to die for their wives. So if you are not dying every day for your wife in that type of service to her, then you're not honoring her you're not leading her as Christ would lead her. And that's, so I understand like the submit part in there, and when the Bible calls on wives to submit, that's like a hard thing. That's something that's controversial. But the idea that comes after it is you need to die for your wife. Yeah. And even in 1 Peter 3, when he's talking to husbands, if you don't honor your wife in this way, God doesn't hear your prayers. Yeah. That is like red alert serious. So yeah, I think it's based a lot on misinterpretation. I think it's based upon like the combination of here's the societal standard and it has to be what the biblical standard is. I think it's really twisted. Yeah. And it stems back from the beginning of the Bible. Let's just be real. I mean, it all starts in the Garden of Eden, right? Where the first human to fall was Eve. Mm-hmm. Where she was tempted by the devil, and so since Eve sinned first, that made her lesser than man. Obviously, of course, yeah, that's sure. I'm saying that sarcastically. If you can't see me if you're not watching this on YouTube, I'm saying this very sarcastically. I do not mean this in any way. Let me just say that. But that's where it all stems from. Because that's then where we see, a lot of the roles for men and women come from is when God is kicking them out of the garden. Mm-hmm. We kind of see the beginning of that. And so, I mean, it goes back to the very beginning. This isn't something that is presented in just the New Testament or the Old Testament. It's all the way back in Genesis. Mm-hmm. And, that's just where a lot of misinterpretation comes from. And what happens is over time, those things get taught. Now I don't really hear lessons that are, women should be in the kitchen and women should be doing all this anymore. I think that there were times when those lessons were preached, and they probably still are in places today too. But now I've already gotten on this soapbox once and get on it again. Now it's become more of a joke in the church, where it's like, it's women's work, guys shouldn't be doing this and shouldn't be doing that. That's the woman's job. A true man doesn't do that, right? You're just supposed to work, provide for your family, just like I said, carry the world on your shoulders before, you're the head. That's how you're supposed to lead, right? You're supposed to be the rock of your family. And, I think we get that idea because of things like, hearing the jokes and hearing those different stereotypes growing up within the church. And again, when you say things like that, you may not mean it, but you don't know how other people are going to hear it and how they're going to take that on themselves. And I said this at the beginning too, especially with young boys. When you talk like that around young boys, when you say those kinds of jokes and those things around them, they don't take those things as jokes always. Maybe they do sometimes, but not always. They're listening to the things that you say and things that you teach. And what you're teaching them is that, one, making those jokes is okay, which it's not. That's degrading women, and that's definitely not okay. And two, that's putting those ideas in their head that that's how men are supposed to be, and that you can treat your wives and you can treat women in that way because that's manhood, right? And if that adult man said that, I look up to him and I want to be a man like him because he's a man. And so that's how I'm going to act and that's how I'm going to be. And that's,
that's not true. That's not how you're supposed to live your life. And I think we've looked at people in the Bible, especially Jesus, who I don't think anyone in the church could argue with the way Jesus lived his life. It's not that way at all. I would say, if you're making those jokes, if you're living your life in that way, I can pretty confidently say that you're wrong in doing that. I don't love just saying that, but I mean, it's true. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I definitely agree. One of the interesting things for me is when Christianity was introduced in the first century, people mocked it. Like the philosophers mocked it because the people it appealed to were women and slaves and children. Yeah. And now Christianity is seen as completely the opposite. Yeah. It's like, this is the degradation. And I think that Christianity truly is that beautiful balance of elevating women to equal personhood with men, but also that men are called on to lead households and called in congregations to lead, whether it be as elders or deacons, stuff like that. So I think that there's roles and boundaries that God has put in place, but also at the same time, women are not supposed to seem like less in the kingdom. As a matter of fact, they were elevated, and should continue to be. So I agree with what Charlie was saying. And as he was talking about with women's work and stuff like that, I genuinely think that as a man, you should be cooking for your wife, like at least a little bit. I know that it's super easy to be like, well, cooking is hard or something else like that. It like there's three like ingredient crock-pot macaroni and cheese you can make. It's not that difficult. Just put in the effort. Like genuinely try to serve your woman. Try to serve the people that you're around. So that's biblical masculinity to me. Serving as Jesus did. Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just kind of hitting, to summarize it all, guys, it's, I know it's difficult to be open, to be emotional, and to show, that side of you. But I hope something that you've gotten out of this is looking through the Bible and looking at examples of people that can be role models, is that's okay. Mm-hmm. It's okay to be emotional. It's okay to open up to different people. It's okay to show that side of who you are, because we're all that way on the inside. Mm-hmm. We all have emotions. We all have feelings. Some of us try to bury those down as far as we possibly can. That's not good. It's not healthy, and it's not going to help you. If you want to be truly strong and you want to be what a man should be, open up, share those emotions, be vulnerable to people, build stronger relationships with each other. Mm-hmm. That's what makes you strong. That's what makes you better. Is by working together, not trying to take it all on by yourself.
For sure.
It's okay. It's okay to show emotions, basically. It's okay to be artistic. It's okay to do things that maybe culturally is kind of weird for a guy to do. It's okay to have close relationships with other guys. There's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. We see people in the Bible greeting each other with kisses, with hugs, and it was guys with guys greeting each other in those ways and having those relationships. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's completely platonic, right? There's no sin in that in any way. It's okay to act in that way and to behave in that way. Weakness is not always weakness. Meekness isn't weakness, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Jesus, in the way he lived his life, was a very meek person. He was quiet, but he also was scared at times, and that was not weakness. That was him being humble and a good servant to people as well, and loving people too. Just having love for everybody. And so, I guess that's really all I have.
And that's a lot. There's just, I mean, as we mentioned, like this subject could go on forever. We could talk about this a lot more. But as Charlie mentioned, I think when we are so much more vulnerable with each other, and I think that this also begins with the vulnerability with God, and we understand our position before God as well. Absolutely. Just as we talked about with David a little bit in the Psalms, he's not pouring out his heart to other people unless he's telling them, come worship God. He's pouring out his heart to God, saying, my enemies are surrounding me, or I've sinned against you, or I'm brokenhearted. Like some of them are really dark. They're very emotionally vulnerable because he understands his position in front of God. And I think that relationship with God helps him with his relationship with Jonathan and other things like that. So when you get that relationship right, when you're starting to work on that, and you're vulnerable with God, it'll definitely help your vulnerability with other people. So
I promise you, it will only help you feel better.
For sure.
trust me, I've never walked out of a conversation with a friend where I've opened up to them and talked to them feeling worse than when I went into it, ever. I don't think I ever will. There's nothing more relieving, and you get no more peace than opening up and praying with your friend and you know, leaning on somebody else besides yourself.
Yeah. So this is a little bit of a raw one. Like, as men talking about this subject, we've encountered in the church a lot of different opinions. We've seen in society the way that women are portrayed, how men are portrayed. We've also seen like the too far side of it, like where society is like, I don't know, trying to degrade people exclusively based upon their sex and stuff like that. So we're just trying to really focus on what our call is. What do we see examples of in Scripture? How does a true biblical man look like? How do we act? And it's servant leadership. It's honoring God above all things. It's loving. It's being vulnerable and honest, but also being willing to stand up for those who are hurting, stand up for righteousness, and just do what God has called you to do. So that's pretty much my summary.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything else to add to that. Yeah.
All right, great. Cool. So thanks, Charlie, for coming on again.
Thanks for having me on. Thank you guys for listening.
Yeah, Charlie wanted to keep this one short. We didn't go short, but it's a hard subject. So. But thank you guys again for listening to the Pilgrim song. We will see you next week.